So the Stuarts are finished, and we're going to have the Hanoverians, aka the Georgians, next, and the long 18th century. So fucking James II has had to fuck off to France, and there's a new law that says the king can't be a Catholic, the Catholic can't be a king, and because the Stuarts are all fucking dead apart from James and his children, this means that the House of Stuart is fucking finished, and the British have had to fucking find some other cunts to be the kings. Now, now then, what happens next is that they find these cunts from Hanover, and Hanover is in Germany, and the cunt there was named George, and he was a grandson of the sister of James the First, and fucking hell, he was a grandson of Elizabeth the Winter Queen, who was the daughter of King James the First and Sixth. And this cunt George didn't speak a fucking word of English, and he only spoke German. Well, I don't know if he spoke French, but he didn't speak English. So this was the new system. Now, we talked a lot about all the political and religious changes that happened and problems that had existed in the 16th and 17th centuries. These problems had created an interesting situation and a very complicated situation in Britain. By the way, Britain now exists as a political entity because because Scotland and England have joined together officially in an act of union. Previously, they had been ruled by the same kings, but they had been separate countries with their own parliaments and their own different laws and stuff. Whereas now they were together in one kingdom, and the flag, the Union flag, sometimes called Union Jack, was invented with the red cross of St. George and the diagonal white on blue cross of St. Andrew together. That red diagonal one wasn't in it at the time because that's the Irish St. Patrick flag. And at that time, at the beginning of the 18th century, Ireland was fucked over by the British but wasn't officially recognised as being a part of the Union. Many of the Scottish people didn't like this. They were pissed off, and the only reason why it happened was because the English bribed a group of Scottish politicians to sign this fucking document to join, and it certainly didn't represent the wishes of most Scottish people. So yeah. Going back to the religious and political problems, what we've had in the past are two things happening. We've had religion falling apart. The old Catholic unity has gone out the window, and you've got Catholics, you've got Church of England, and you've got these other Protestant groups as well who are not in agreement with the Church of England, and they have their own different religious ideas. Now, these people are called non-conformists because they don't conform to the Church of England's teachings. And they have many different groups, the Quakers, the Anabaptists, the Methodists, loads of different ones. And America is an example of a country where they still have all these different churches, all these different faiths, which are all Protestant, all Christian and all Protestant, but they're different. Now in Britain, one of the questions was, are we going to allow these people to have these different religious beliefs? We've already told the Catholics that they're fucked and we shit on the Catholics. Are we going to shit on the non-conformists as well and say you've all got to be Church of England or fuck yourself? And this was a question that came about, and Cromwell, he was a cunt, but one good thing about Cromwell was he did allow people to have their religious beliefs unless they were Catholic, because he himself was a Puritan, which is one of the crazy groups. Many of the people who went to America and were these pilgrims were people from these non-conformist Protestant groups who were leaving England and going to America because they thought they'd be treated better and they could worship their fucking religion and in peace and quiet and with freedom, or maybe even fucking tell other people that they have to have those religious beliefs and stuff. Anyway, so they fucked off to America because of the religion. In Britain, the king had been told he can't do whatever the fuck he wants because Charles had his head cut off. However, the people of Britain had said, we don't really want a republic, we want to have a king. So they brought back Charles II, but then they'd said to James II, you can't do whatever the fuck you want, because we're going to get rid of you. So you've got this interesting situation where the Parliament has become quite powerful, and kings have to be very careful, because if they act in a tyrannical way, then they are likely to be overthrown. We've had 2 Stuart kings overthrown for acting like cunts and pissing people off. So that has led to political ideas about the relationship between governments and people, especially kings and people, and about what a parliament is and what it means for people to be represented in the business of government and politics. In the old times, it had been considered normal that the king was chosen by God and that he could do whatever he wanted. Now, in reality, they often got overthrown, as you've seen time and time again, by rivals or by the people. But the idea, the principle was that kings are God's chosen representatives on earth, and that they have the right to rule the country and are the boss. This changed over the course of the 17th century, and some thinkers were writing about the ideas of kings and people. One of the most important philosophers was a man called John Locke, who wrote that kings don't have power from God. They get their power from the people, and it's the people who have the real rights and the real position to say whether they're happy with the system of government that they have. And if they get pissed off with the government or the king, then they have every right to get rid of it and replace it with something that they prefer. So this idea was really revolutionary, the idea that the people can fucking get rid of a king or a government if they don't fucking like it. And that's what's led to what we have today with democracy. So that's important, so we'll keep that in mind. Now, also, these religious ideas about people should have freedom to worship as they like and not be told what to fucking think and believe by the state have combined with these ideas about kings not being completely in control and about parliaments and some form of representation coming to existence. Those 2 things have united, and the ideas about religious freedom and freedom of thought and freedom of speech and not being persecuted for being a non-conformist have combined with the ideas of the king being challenged by parliaments and about parliaments having more power and kings having less power and the people having more representation. Strangely enough, they still don't like Catholics, and they're still happy to persecute Catholics and treat Catholics like shit. That's a strange little anomaly or difference in their ideas. One of the reasons for this combination is that in other countries in Europe, continental Europe, like France, most notably, the kings who are completely in control and have absolute authority have tended to be Catholic and have tended to shit on the Protestants and say the Protestants can't do fuck all and that you can't be Protestant and we're going to fucking kill you if you're Protestant and all that kind of thing. And in the Netherlands, where they had a republic and kings not having so much power, they had more freedom of ideas and they had a lot of Protestants there, and it was a Protestant country with a lot of these non-conformist groups. So people who lived in England were worried about Catholics coming into power because they thought the Catholics would create an absolute monarchy and would be killing the Protestants and stuff. Catholics in other countries, Catholic monarchs were worried about Protestants because they thought Protestants would bring about some kind of revolutionary change and destroy the monarchies like the Dutch had sort of done and like the English had done in the English Civil War. So these ideas had all come together and created this sort of idea of sort of political freedom and sort of freedom of ideas and stuff, which is something on the way towards the ideas that we all respect today and live with, that you can choose your own governments and you are free to think and worship and believe what you like and say what you like. But those ideas weren't shared by everybody back then. And what happened in England was the development of the first political parties to exist. Now there are lots of different political parties. You've got socialist parties, conservative parties, liberal parties, green parties, all kinds of different political parties, and we all know what they are and what they do. Back in those times, they started because of these ideas about religion and politics. So the Whigs and the Tories were the first two groups. Whigs, spelled W-H-I-G, Whig. They were the ones who wanted Parliament to have more power and for the king to have less power. They were worried about Catholics. They were worried about monarchies. They didn't like the French very much. They were very keen for more religious freedom for everybody apart from Catholics, and they were very keen for the kings to be stripped of powers, and for parliaments to be increased and to have more rights, and for the representation of people to expand. The Tories, T-O-R-Y, the Tories were the second group, and they were the opposite. They wanted to keep a strong government and a strong king and a strong religion, one religion for everybody, the Church of England. Also, some of them were Catholics as well, and they didn't want Parliament to get more powerful. They wanted this strong conservative state that punished rebellion and prevented revolution, and told everybody what to do. You would say that the Whigs were more progressive, that their ideas were more sort of similar to the ideas that we have today in democratic liberal societies. and the Tories were kind of more of the old way of thinking. However, the Tories had some good reasons because they wanted to prevent something like the English Civil War from happening by, again, by stopping people from publishing and talking about revolution, rebellion, and all that, and by making sure everybody had the same religion so that they wouldn't be arguing and fighting. Whereas the Whigs also thought they could prevent revolution by modernizing the system and giving people rights and representation so that they wouldn't feel that they had to have a revolution. Now, King George I was a fucking German king and he didn't speak a word of English. And this was really good for the Whigs because the Whigs wanted Parliament to sort of run things and the king to take a back seat. So the fact he couldn't speak English meant that it was quite hard for him to be able to fucking do anything. So the Whigs became the more powerful of the two political parties in the beginning of the 18th century and the first half of the 18th century, really. And the first ever real prime minister was a man called Walpole, and Walpole was just some guy who was quite rich and powerful, who was a Whig politician who said he'd help the king run the country, and basically ran the country and made all the decisions in the king's name. And he was the first man to do that, and this started the process that we have today of having a prime minister who really runs the country while the king takes a back seat and doesn't actively control things. So really we're seeing the beginnings of the modern political system in Britain and the system of government with two political parties and a prime minister running the country and the king taking a back seat, and there being various ideas and groups of people with different ideas challenging each other and forming organizations trying to influence policy. Right, so then George I didn't really do very much, but it's important that he didn't do very much because it meant that the progress of parliamentary government took a step forward. Now, during this time, the British had created a very large empire, which included parts of America, not really Africa yet, but Australia ended up being part of the empire as well, New Zealand, and it was quite big at the beginning of the 18th century. And the British had been fighting the Spanish a lot. They'd been enemies since Queen Elizabeth I. And they were enemies because of religious reasons, but also mainly because of fighting over the lands in America and in the Caribbean. There were lots of pirates at this time, beginning of the 18th century. And the British actually decided to get rid of the pirates and to crush the pirates with the big navy. Britain had a big navy as well, which helped the British to sort of create this empire and benefit from having an empire with trade and the movement of goods around the empire. So stuff you couldn't get in Britain, they could bring it from America and India and whatever, tea from China, whatever. Sugar from Jamaica. Also, the businessmen and people who were successful with money became more prominent, and the old aristocracy were really becoming less powerful in society, and people who were clever with money and business were becoming more powerful. And so we're really seeing big changes now in the 18th century. Um, in the middle of the 18th century, there is a big war. And this war is called the 7 Years' War because it was 7 years long. And it involved the French, the British, the Prussians, the Austrians, and the Russians, also the Dutch and some other smaller countries as well. And it took place over several continents because the French and the British and the Spanish had colonies in America. The French and the British had them in India. And there was all fighting all over the world. It was quite important because it led to the American Revolution, but we'll come back to that later. Now, during the middle part of the 18th century, in Britain there were big developments in science and in the science of agriculture, of how to grow things to eat, and farming. And these changes made it much easier to produce food much more quickly and much more easily. And this led to the population growing a lot and there being a lot more people in Britain. It also led to the Industrial Revolution, which was when the British created a lot of new machines for producing materials and goods, and machines to help them in mining and in all kinds of industry and technology. So Britain became the most advanced industrial and technological country in the world, which also helped its military as well. And then that also helped the empire, which then helped the economy and so on and so forth. And these very large cities were created. Liverpool, Bristol was already quite big, but Liverpool, Manchester, they became these big cities with a lot of work and a lot of business, producing a lot. And Britain was the first industrial country to have this revolution. Other countries followed with their revolutions, but they happened a little bit later. So Britain became extremely powerful economically and in the military. Now, in Europe and in America, there was something else very important happening, and this was something called the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment was a movement of ideas, and these ideas were different, but importantly similar. So previously, kings had been saying, you can't say this, you can't do that, you can't write this, and so on. Events in Britain had led to people having more freedom to say things and do things, and the Whigs and so on. In France, the kings had said, no, you're fucking still doing what we tell you to do, and we're going to tell you what to think and what to say and stuff. And as for parliament, no fucking way, we're having absolute monarchy. And they really didn't change. But many of the writers did, and developments in science had happened a lot over the last 100, 200 years. Isaac Newton and others, and there were big changes in science, and that helped to change people's religious beliefs, because some of the science didn't really support the religious views that people had. And also the Protestant religions had advanced, and there was people saying, well, we don't want to see people being killed because of religion, we want religious freedom and freedom of ideas generally. And if I want to say I don't believe in God, then I think that that's good. I can say there is no God. I can say that religion is bollocks. I can say that kings are a bunch of dickheads and that we should have republics and we shouldn't have religion and all these different ideas. And there were different writers and philosophers and people who developed these ideas and these philosophies, and they criticized governments, they criticized kings, and they criticized religions. And a lot of them had ideas about creating some kind of democracy, ideas about having complete freedom of speech and freedom to say and think what you like. And they were very, very influential. And in America, those ideas combined with the ideas of John Locke and so on, and led to the American Revolution. Now, the American Revolution happened as a combination of ideas and events. So I mentioned the 7 Years' War, and during the 7 Years' War, the British government was fighting against the French in North America, and they spent a lot of money, and the British government said to the colonists in America, these are British subjects living in America, the British government said to them, right, we spent a lot of fucking money defending you and protecting you from the French, so you have to fucking pay for it. So we're gonna make you pay loads of money, and if you don't pay us the money, then we're just gonna tax you loads and everything, introduce lots of new taxes. So they did all this stuff with taxes, and they were taking loads of money off the people in America. And people in America said, oh, this isn't fucking fair because we don't get to say what we want. We're not included in the British Parliament. We're not members of Parliament. We don't have representation, but we're being taxed, and it's not fucking fair. So during the 1750s and 1760s, this movement grows, and it ends with the Americans defeating the British in war and kicking the British out of America and establishing a republic and the United States of America with the Declaration of Independence in the year 1776. And this is very, very important, as you know, for America, USA. But it didn't stop with America. These ideas continued. Now we go back to the British politics. Now the Whigs were the ones whose ideas were sort of more similar to the American ideas than the Tories, but nobody in Britain really, most powerful people in Britain, the politicians, didn't want to have a revolution. And many of them thought that by having a mixed system where Parliament and the people had more power, that would help to keep the monarchy and stuff, because it would stop people from having revolutions. And the Tories were saying, well, look at the Americans. When you let people have freedom, then they're going to have revolution. So it's interesting clash of ideas. So what happens next in Europe is that the French have a revolution, and this happens in 1789. Now, we skipped King George II, so let's go back a bit. So we'll pause things here. We've had the American Revolution. We'll go back a bit. Now, remember James II getting kicked out of the country for being a cunt and all that, even though he wasn't that big a cunt, it was because he was a Catholic. Now, there were these people called Jacobites, and they were the people who liked James and supported him. And James had come back and tried to take over, but he'd been kicked out. And his son had been in France, and his name was also James, but we'll call him the Old Pretender. His nickname was the Old Pretender. The Old Pretender had tried various times to come back and invade Britain, and he found a lot of friends in Scotland, especially the Highlanders. And the Highlanders in Scotland wanted to have the Stuarts back on the throne because they thought they could make Scotland free again, and also because they were Catholics, many of them. And after several attempts failed, the Old Pretender stopped trying, but his son, who's called Charles, took over the leadership of the Jacobites, and he went to Scotland, and they had a invasion of England with the Scottish Highlanders, but in the end they lost, and Charles was told to fuck off, and he was called Bonnie Prince Charlie. And after his defeat, the British government started shitting on the Scottish and oppressing the Scottish and fucking them over a lot, so it wasn't good for Scotland in the end. The Brit then, so then we'll go. George II was the king then. After George II, we had George III, and George III was the king during the American Revolution all the way through. In fact, he was the longest reigning king we've ever had. He was king for, I think, 60 years, and he's the third longest reigning monarch in British history. And he also was famous because he was fucking crazy. He went mad and had to spend a lot of his time in a mental hospital. King George III. And George III liked the Tories better than the Whigs, and that's quite important. But when he was in mental hospital, the Whigs became more popular and more powerful, and when he got out, they became less powerful. During the first half of the 18th century, the Whigs had been more successful and had been in power because of the German kings not being very powerful. But in the second half of the 18th century, because of George III and because of the British government trying to oppress the Americans, the Tories became the more powerful of the two groups. And now we'll go back to 1789. Now the French Revolution starts, and this is a combination of all of the ideas of the Enlightenment plus the example of the American Revolution, and also the situation that happens in France, the economic situation that they find themselves in. Now, in France, they hadn't, as I said, they hadn't developed their politics to accommodate representation or a parliamentary system. What they had done instead is to replace the aristocracy with a absolute monarchy, and the monarch was a complete fucking cunt who told everyone what to do. And Louis XIV was the most famous of these late 17th century monarchs, and his children and grandchildren hadn't changed that system, and it was a very oppressive system, and people were fucking shat on by the government and by the king. But people were getting sick of it, and some people thought that Britain was better than France, and some people thought that America was fucking great. And anyway, they were sick of this fucking king. And now the king in France at this time was King Louis XVI, and he was a poor old cunt. And in the American War of Independence, the French had supported the Americans and spent a lot of money in that war. In fact, they'd spent so much money in that fucking war that they'd spent all the money and they didn't have any fucking money left. So it was a bit of a fucking problem. Now, the King of France was desperate for money, and they didn't have a parliament like the British one, but they had something similar where they could get representatives from the people together to agree to create a new tax that people would have to pay in France to the government, a big one. And in France, they had something called the Estates General, and the Estates General was an organization. It was a meeting of representatives of the three groups of French society. And those three groups were: one, the church, which is all of the priests and the bishops and stuff; two, the aristocracy, that's all the lords and bishops, lords and dukes and barons and counts and cunts; and third, everybody else. Now, the everybody else is 99.99% of the population, and the other two groups are very, very, very small minorities. But each of the three groups had the same power in this meeting, and the meeting was to create new taxes. Now, another thing is that the nobility or the aristocracy didn't have to pay any fucking taxes. They were exempt. And the church, the same. They didn't pay taxes. So the only people who were going to pay the taxes were the third group, the third estate, they're called, which is all the people, all the ordinary people, the business people and the peasants and the poor and, you know, everybody who's not church or aristocrat. So, of course, the aristocracy and the church agree to have these taxes because they're not going to have to pay them anyway and they're going to benefit from them. And everybody else has to, they can say no, but they don't get listened to because they've only got one vote and there are two votes from the others, even though as part of the population they are the very, very big majority of the population. So the French said, that's not fucking fair, this is fucking stupid, we want a change, we're fucking sick of this, it's not fucking fair, we have to pay these taxes but our representation isn't worth shit. So they start fucking kicking off and they start rising up, and it ends up with the king getting his head cut off, and with the monarchy of France being completely abolished and finished, and the creation of a French Republic. Now, when this happens, the British and other European countries who have monarchies don't like it because they think, fuck, all the violence and the French fucking rising up and killing their leaders and killing their king, that could happen here. So they all start fighting against the French and trying to force them to quit their revolution and to put the king back on the throne, or another king. Napoleon Bonaparte comes along and becomes the great military leader in general of the French, and he kicks the shit out of all of the other countries that are trying to fight against the French. And you know, he's really fucking famous and one of the greatest fucking generals and military leaders in history. Now this leads to the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon doesn't stay true to the ideas of the French Revolution. He actually creates himself into a dictator and makes himself emperor of the Republic of France. And then he starts invading all other countries in Europe and taking over Europe. The British think he's a cunt and they don't like him. And during the Napoleonic Wars, the British are always fighting against Napoleon the whole fucking time. Now, there are two very important military leaders in Britain. The first is called Horatio Nelson, and he's an admiral of the British Navy. And he kicks the shit out of the French Navy and destroys it, and the Spanish Navy destroys it at the Battle of Trafalgar. That's why we have Trafalgar Square in London, and Nelson's column is the big statue in the middle. Nelson died in that battle, but it was a really important battle because it meant that Napoleon could not invade Britain because we fucking controlled the sea. Then he had to concentrate on fucking over people in continental Europe instead, like Austria and Russia, and stuff. Anyway, the Napoleonic Wars finished in 1815 when the Duke of Wellington, who was a British commander, defeated Napoleon Bonaparte at the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon had been defeated by all his enemies in 1813, 1814, when they all collectively got together and kicked his ass. In 1812, Napoleon had invaded Russia, and it was a big fucking mistake because it's cold and they all fucking died there. And then he was fucked. And then all the European powers got together and they fucked him over. And they told him he had to go and live on this fucking island called Elba and stay there. But he said, fuck that, and he came back to France. He got all his friends together. Everyone in France fucking loved him. And he got a big army together. And the British under the Duke of Wellington were in Belgium. And there was also another army commanded by the Prussians that was in Belgium. And then Napoleon said, I'm going to fight them. And they had a couple of battles, and then a big battle called Waterloo, in which the British and the Prussians kicked the shit out of the French. Napoleon had to go and live on this island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean as a prisoner of the British, and he was fucked. So the British and their allies defeated Napoleon, and the French had to have a fucking king again, which they didn't want. And these sort of revolutionary movements in Europe were kind of given a bit of a kicking, and the old monarchies and the old ideas were fucking surviving and were in power. But those ideas of revolution and the ideas of progress and democracy and freedom were not going away. They were still going to stay there, and they were going to have more influence in the future. In Britain, the Tories and the King George had been really worried about the French Revolution because they thought that something similar could happen in Britain. And because the Tories were the ones in power, not the Whigs, instead of saying, well, we'll give people more freedom so that they won't have to have revolutions, instead of saying that, they said, well, we'll fucking oppress people and stop them from organizing and stop them from writing and stop them from reading and fucking keep them under the hard fist and the hard boot so that they won't give us any fucking trouble, so that we won't have a fucking French Revolution happening in Britain. In the year 1819, there's a meeting of people in Manchester who want to listen to a politician called Henry Hunt talk about democracy and freedom. And the government sends in soldiers and they fucking massacre the people at this meeting. And it's called the Peterloo Massacre because they said it looked like Waterloo because it was all bloody in that. And it happened in a place called St. Peter's Field. So we start to have some social and political unrest in England, and because the government's being quite hard at this time, this leads to organisations in secret, and it leads also to the Whigs becoming more radical because the Tories have sort of taken over the government by being close to the king. So the Whigs have to try to be more radically democratic and more radically Republican. Some of them Republican, but most of them just want more parliamentary power so that they can get back in to power. So eventually the Tories change and become the Conservatives, and eventually the Whigs change and become the Liberals. But this develops over the second half of the 19th century. So we are at present in the first quarter of the 19th century, which is the fall of Napoleon, then the death of George III, who is followed by his son George IV, who likes fucking shagging and getting drunk and stuff, and dies quite young, replaced by his brother William IV, who's a bit shit, doesn't do anything. And then we get Queen Victoria and the Victorian period. And that's the topic of the next one. Okay, so there it is.